asleep. So if I sort of keel sideways halfway through speaking to you this evening, somebody throw something at me. That would be very helpful. Anyway, I guess the first thing I need to say is Happy Thanksgiving. You can say that back. You can say, wonderful. That's good. Do an impression of being alive. It's so much more encouraging when you stand up here at the front. Happy Thanksgiving. Now, the interesting thing is this. You will have worked out from my peculiar accent that I am not a Canadian standing amongst you this evening. I'm not an Australian either. Somebody asked me at supper. I am, in fact, from the UK. And my wife and I arrived here in Canada just 3 months ago. So we're learning our way around things in your wonderful country. And we do not have Thanksgiving in the UK. Somebody asked me that. Do you have Thanksgiving in England? We do not celebrate Thanksgiving. It's not a holiday we celebrate. That's not because, as somebody asked me, is it because your climate is so terrible that you are miserable all the time? That is not the answer. The answer is simply that we are miserable all the time. The climate has nothing whatsoever to do with it. But the thing is this, migrating to a new country, perhaps some of you here this evening are more recently arrived here in Canada, migrating to a new country can raise all kinds of questions, can't it? What is Thanksgiving? What is Tim Hortons? Why does traffic not move on the DVP? Will it be cold in December? All kinds of questions it can raise. It can lead to culture shock. It can lead to looking foolish when you ask obvious questions about the new country. My wife and I have spent many an evening asking our Canadian friends questions for them to look at us in bafflement and go, how can you not know that? That's so obvious. And I felt quite bad until recently. I read a wonderful story in, I think it was the Globe and Mail, that was telling us about a website that the BC Tourist Board had run during the recent Winter Olympics. They'd set up this wonderful website so that people around the world who didn't know anything about Canada could email in with their questions. And boy, did they get some amazing questions. In fact, some of the questions were so wonderful that some people who worked for the tourist office took those questions when the Olympics were over and posted them anonymously on a website along with what they thought the answers should have been. Let me give you an example of the kind of questions that came in from around the world. Somebody from England emailed to say this: I have never seen it warm on Canadian television. How do the plants grow? The answer was, well, we import all of our plants fully grown, and then we sit around and we watch them die. Somebody from Sweden emailed to ask, I want to walk from Vancouver to Toronto. Can I just follow the railroad tracks? Of course, the answer to that is, yes, of course. Just do make sure you take plenty of water with you. Somebody from the USA, our southern neighbours, emailed to ask, which direction is north in Canada? The reply on the website was, face south, turn 180 degrees, and keep walking. We'll send more directions later. And my all-time favourite, somebody from Germany emailed to say, are there supermarkets in Toronto? And is milk available all year round? To which the answer was, no, we are a peaceful civilization of vegan hunter-gatherers, and milk is entirely illegal. Amazing questions. And I was told that you Canadians don't do sarcasm. That's the amazing thing. And the thing is this, a lot of these questions, funny as they are, well, of course, they arise. What do they arise from? They arise out of ignorance. They arise out of ignorance. We're puzzled by what we don't know. We're puzzled and mystified by what we don't understand. And sometimes our reaction to the unknown, our reaction to things we don't understand, goes a bit further than mere puzzlement. Sometimes we can be afraid of what we don't understand. We can be anxious about the unknown. We can become quite fearful. And that drama sketch we saw so wonderfully performed a few minutes ago played with that whole idea of fear and uncertainty and the unknown. And I would suggest that we actually live in a country in which there is something of a culture of fear. Something of a culture of fear. Fear seems to be everywhere. these days. Fear seems to be everywhere. We live in a culture of fear. If you open up a newspaper, if you turn on the radio, if you flick on the television, surf the internet, the headlines scream at us all the time, don't they? They're talking about layoffs at work, downturns in the economy, fighting in the Middle East, global warming, bird flu, swine flu, product recalls, food scares, travel advisories, and of course, since 9/11, we've had a whole new fear to worry about. We've had global terrorism. Not a day goes by without some terrorist plot foiled, a bomb discovered, some jihadis arrested, a hijacking, a shooting. It's not so much television as terror vision. I was reading in the newspaper just the other day that the Americans, so scared are they of a jihadi terrorist plot in Europe, they have just issued a travel advisory to France. And the thing is, this excited the French, because the French, like the Canadians, get wonderfully excited when their country is even mentioned on the US news, even if it's for something like, please don't go there, you might die. 9/11 changed everything. 9/11 changed everything. I'm sure many of you who were around at the time of 9/11, there are some very young folks here, but those of you who lived through that like I did can probably remember where you were when the news broke about 9/11. It changed everything. And the thing about fear is this: fear sells. Fear sells. Fear causes magazines to fly off the shelves. It sells newspapers. It puts money in the system. Fear glues us to our seats. We keep tuning in. We keep listening. We keep reading because we're afraid we'll be out of date. We're afraid we'll be out of touch. We're afraid that since the last news broadcast, something has changed. We have 24-hour, 7 days a week television. The headlines compel us to stay tuned in, don't they? You walk past the newsstand, there's some amazingly dramatic headline, and you're compelled to pick up the newspaper and buy it. In fact, just this very morning, I was sent an email from a friend in Europe with a horrifying news story. The headline on the email was, "Aircraft crashes into 4 buildings in Europe." And I was like, oh my word, what has happened now? And I clicked and opened the email, and I saw the following picture. Fear sells, and sometimes fear and headlines are used to manipulate us. But the interesting thing about fear is this: fear is not just external. Fear, I think, is also sometimes internal. Fear can be internal. We fear insignificance. We worry at times. Sometimes we lie awake at night worrying, do I really matter? Fear of insignificance can drive us to seek attention, to crave attention, to attract attention. We name drop, we show off, we chase celebrity. We want to somehow prove to the world that we really do matter. In 2006, a survey was done of teenagers. 51% of people aged 13 to 19 said being famous was their number one life goal. Being famous, not finding the cure for cancer, not breaking some athletic record, not doing some major work of charity, not setting up a business. No, they wanted to be famous. They wanted their name in lights. 51% of teenagers. And this is not a new phenomena either. The rock band, the Counting Crows, in 1993 sang this on one of their albums. They said, "When I look at the television, I want to see me staring back at me." We all want to be big stars, but we don't know why, and we don't know how. There is even a company called Celeb for a Day. You can go to their website if you like, celebforaday.com, when you get home, or if you're very, very bored already and you have an iPhone, you can do that now. And you can go to Celeb for a Day and you can hire this company, and they will send fake paparazzi to follow you round as you go around Toronto, as you walk into Tim Hortons, as you queue on the DVP. The paparazzi will be there taking your photograph, because then other people might think you're famous. Fame has become hugely important. Why? Well, because we're afraid of insignificance. We're afraid of being insignificant. And fear of inadequacy, fear of insignificance is also used to sell us things too. Advertisers love to play on that fear. So L'Oreal, the perfume manufacturer, lots of their adverts use the slogan, "You're worth it." You know, you may think that you're insignificant, but we don't. And we love you so much, we've created this perfume for you to spend $100 on to slaver all over yourself. So when the fake paparazzi come, you smell nice. Levi, the jeans company, are fond of constructing adverts that basically say, buy our jeans and wear them, and people of the opposite sex will find you very attractive. They might not like you before, but afterwards put our jeans on and you will be somebody. Fear is used by advertisers to great effect. But fear is interesting when you begin exploring what fear actually is. At its heart, fear is all about loss of control. If there are things you're afraid of here this evening and you begin analysing that and thinking what that means, fear ultimately is a perceived lack of control. But fear and anxiety and worry are quite serious things too, because fear separates us from one another. Fear can cause us to mistrust our neighbours. Fear can cause us to question our colleagues, to be suspicious of the people we meet. The neighbours thing is interesting. My wife and I, when we were first married 12 years ago, we lived in an apartment building in London. There were 6 apartments in this building. We almost never saw our neighbours because people would come in, scuttle inside their apartment, shut the door, put all the bolts on, and not talk to anybody. Everybody was afraid of everybody else. We're afraid, aren't we, that behind every Muslim we see in the street is a terrorist. We're afraid behind every group of teenagers are a bunch of muggers who are going to assault us and steal our iPhones. So we close in, we curl up, we hide away, we don't talk to people, we put the barricades up. Fear disconnects us from each other. Now, of course, it has to be said at this point that a healthy fear is a good thing. There are some healthy fears. There are some things it's good to be afraid of. Wearing a seatbelt, keeping back from the cliff edge, washing your hands, not dancing with polar bears. Those are good things. They're going to keep you alive. But fear can easily become worry, and that can become anxiety, and that can become dread. And that then starts becoming a problem. For many years, I was terrified of flying. My wife will tell you she had to almost drug me to get me onto an aircraft. And when she did get me onto the aircraft, I spent the entire time sitting there with white knuckles, gripping the sides of the seat in a death grip, because I was terrified it was going to fall out of the sky, catch fire, get lost, get hijacked, something would go wrong, the wings would fall off, something like that. Completely nuts. It didn't help that I was flying Air Canada, of course, and those of you who have suffered that experience will know that Air Canada's motto is, we're not satisfied until you're not satisfied. But nevertheless, it was a fear of flying that handicapped me for a while. And the thing is this, there are some good fears. And one good fear that I think we've lost in the kind of highly technologized, fast-moving, fast-paced, highly technologized world in which we find ourselves living is awe. Awe is one fear that I think we've lost to ill effect in our culture. There was once upon a time when human beings would look up in wonder at the kind of starry expanse above us, the wonders of the universe. We would look around us at the majesty of creation. We would look at the amazing miracle of life, and we would be awestruck by that. We'd be filled with wonder. Once our eyes looked up in awe to the God who most people believed made all these things, now we look downwards in skepticism. For many of us, if we're honest, in our culture, perhaps some of you here this evening, God has been removed, God has been dethroned and debunked. But the thing is this, if you throw God out, with God go human beings. What do I mean by that? Well, once you throw God out, it becomes very hard to say that human beings are anything other than just very clever animals. Let me share a quote with you from a gentleman called Peter Singer, who is one of the world's leading atheists and ethicists and biologists. And he has written book after book after book, arguing that human beings are no more than clever animals. A rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy, he once was quoted as saying. And he wrote this in a book quite recently. He said, the notion that human life is sacred just because it is human life is utterly medieval. Fear of the sacred, fear of religion. Many people are afraid of religion. Many people are afraid of God even. Dear me, what would it be like if God existed? But that fear has not just disconnected us from other people, it's also disconnected us from ourselves and from our very identity. We're no longer the pinnacle of creation. Human life is no longer sacred. We are just a naked ape. But not only does fear disconnect us from one another, and disconnect us from ourselves, fear also disconnects us from nature. We can't trust nature these days. As one Canadian friend said to me shortly after I arrived in this country, he went, basically, Andy, you've got to remember, in Canada, nature is out to kill you. The mosquitoes will eat you alive in summer if the black flies don't get you first. In the winter, you'll freeze to death. In the summer, you'll cook to death. If you leave your back door open, the raccoons will steal everything you own. Nature is basically out to kill you. And you may think that's extreme. Well, if we're not afraid of nature, we're a bit removed from it. A recent survey showed that 25% of children thought that bacon came from sheep. And 29% thought that oats grew on trees. We buy our food pre-packaged, shrink-wrapped, homogenized, and we have lost our traditional connection to the earth. And that disconnection is particularly significant, particularly interesting when it comes to a festival like Thanksgiving that we're celebrating this weekend. As we become increasingly disconnected from nature, what does Thanksgiving actually mean? What are we actually giving thanks for this weekend as we sit down with our friends and our families around the dinner table? What does it mean to be thankful in a fear-filled world? You see, the problem is that fear is antithetical to thanksgiving. It's very hard to be full of fear and full of gratitude at the same time. The two are kind of mutually exclusive. Yet I would suggest to you this evening that gratitude and thankfulness are essential to building a good society. I think it's a great thing that here in Canada you have a Thanksgiving festival. But what does it mean to be thankful in a world post 9/11 with all this kind of fear all around us? I would also say this: gratitude, as I say, is one of the foundations of our own well-being. If we're grateful people, if we're people whose lives are filled with thanksgiving and we're looking outward and full of gratitude for the things that we have in our lives, we're generally going to be happier. You see, I would say this: in life, we are not made happy by what we acquire, but by what we appreciate. You can get all the possessions you like in the world. You can buy the latest gadgets, the latest clothes, the fastest cars. Ultimately, I would suggest they might occupy you for a while, but they're not going to make you ultimately happy. Ultimately, you're made happy not by what you acquire, but by what you appreciate. But the trouble is this. The trouble today is not that we have nothing to be grateful for, but that many of us feel we have nobody to be thankful to. Who are we thankful to? Who are we giving thanks to at a festival like Thanksgiving? Particularly if you're not a Christian and that's not something that means anything to you, well, who are we thankful to at a festival like Thanksgiving? Who are we expressing gratitude to? Well, some people would say, well, the answer is ourselves. Why is it that I'm happy? Why is it that I have a roof over my head and a nice car and a nice family and nice kids? Well, it's because, my grandparents came here as immigrants and they worked really, really hard, and then my parents were born and they worked even harder, and then I was born and I worked harder still, and I've built my own one-man empire. I'm the person who's responsible, so I'm jolly well thankful to myself. And I've come across people who basically live their lives that way. I'm responsible for all of the good in my life. And the problem with that is that quickly leads to an attitude of, well, I deserve it. I deserve the latest toys. I deserve the latest gadgets. I deserve the latest holiday. And that quickly leads to consumerism and narcissism. You become the center of everything. You don't care about other people. All you do is you buy more and more and more stuff. You reward yourself. And consumerism quickly arises. But consumerism ultimately traps. You can buy all the gadgets, all the clothes, all the wonderful toys and trinkets that you like, but ultimately that is likely to entrap you rather than set you free. The Canadian singer-songwriter Bruce Cockburn, on one of his songs, wrote a very telling line. He said this, he said, "Though chains be of gold, they are chains all the same. Though chains be of gold, they are chains all the same." You can just as easily be trapped by all the possessions that you have as you can by poverty and other things. You see, the problem is this. I think ultimately we have lost our place in the world in 21st century Canada. We've lost our place in the world. And this is actually not a new phenomena. 400 years ago, a gentleman called Blaise Pascal, he was a scientist and a writer and a philosopher. He was also French, but no one's perfect, eh? And I love the cheers and a couple of ohs. I'll be in trouble later. I'll do an American joke later, eh? Blaise Pascal, 400 years ago, leading thinker in Europe, he wrote this, and I think it's a really telling quote. He said, "I know not who put me into the world, nor what the world is, nor what I myself am. I see these frightful spaces of the universe that surround me, and I find myself tied to one corner of this vast expanse, without knowing why I am put in this place rather than in another." nor why the short time which is given to me to live is assigned to me at this point, rather than at any other point of the whole eternity which was before me or which shall come after me. I see nothing but infinites on all sides, which surround me as an atom, and as a shadow which endures only for an instant and returns no more. All I know is that I must soon die, but what I know least is this very death, which I cannot escape. Pascal wrote those words 400 years ago, and I would suggest this evening that actually, if in many ways they're even more true today than when he first wrote them. If you read the popular press, you will discover that science has told us that human beings are just very clever animals, no more special or unique than the grasshopper or the grapefruit. Neurobiology has told us that free will and consciousness are just illusions. Pluralism has told us that it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you are sincere. Philosophers have told us there is no meaning. Psychologists have told us that all that you think you know is actually just a strange convocation of desires and impulses. And physicists tell us that the Earth we inhabit is just this tiny, 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 insignificant speck in this insignificant backwater of the galaxy. If there is no God, as the shrill secular voices in our world are trying to tell us and have us believe, then we really have to resign ourselves to just being an infinitesimally small speck in an infinite universe that doesn't know or care about us. At best, perhaps we can trust stuff. We can buy as many possessions as we can. We can try and live our lives as happily as we can, knowing we have our 70 years and 10, and then bang, it's all over, and it doesn't matter at the end of the day. He who dies with the most toys wins. But what if those shrill secular voices are wrong? What if there is a God who created each one of us here this evening? What if there is a God who wants us not to trust stuff, but to trust him? What if, as the French author and historian Chantal Delsol put it, what if our human lives and experiences are actually intended to point to something bigger than ourselves? What if? But many of us, I think, if we're honest with ourselves this evening, are afraid. Not just afraid necessarily that there isn't a God. I come across many people when you talk to them who are actually afraid that there is a God. What if God does exist? And that's a thought many of us try and push away, particularly at 3 a.m. It's not something we necessarily want to contemplate. Fear doesn't just disconnect us from each other and from the world around us and ourselves. Fear can also disconnect us from God. And if we are disconnected from God, well, life becomes very curious indeed. It's as if we look around us and we see a series of pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, but we have no overall idea how those pieces fit together. I wonder if you've ever sort of thought about this and pondered why it is that if this world, this bodily existence that you and I are enjoying, is all there is, if all that there is the physical, the measurable, the quantifiable, the scientifically explicable, if that's all there is, if that's the sum total of reality, why is it that so much of what seems important to us as human beings is not explainable in those categories? What do I mean? Well, let me give you just a few examples. Consider for a moment the transcendent sense of wonder that beauty and art and music can evoke, the excitement and thrill and joy of what it means to be in love, the sense of awe and wonder and the numinous that some of the amazing landscapes that you have here in Canada can evoke, the importance that we place on truth and justice and right and wrong. Those are all, I would suggest, deeply bound up with what it really means to be human. Yet disconnect God, take God out of the picture, and ultimately those things become illusions because everything becomes personal preference. You may think that a Beethoven symphony or a Mozart concerto is the most wonderful thing you've ever heard. I personally would prefer John Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence, an amazing track not recommended as a ringtone. You may think that you're in love. I think it's just a chemical imbalance in your brain. You may think that Banff National Park is one of the wonders of the world. I quite personally would rather concrete it over and build the world's biggest Tim Hortons and stuff it full of donuts. You may think we should fight for justice and truth. I personally think the weak should be exploited and survival of the fittest should be championed. Ultimately, it's just personal preference. Yet most of us know instinctively there is something wrong with what I have just described. Most of us instinctively know that what I've just spoken there is nonsense. Yet perhaps these scattered pieces, these shattered fragments of the transcendent beauty and art and aesthetics and love and truth and justice and morality, perhaps those fragments are, if we stop and consider them for a moment, pointers to something else, signs to something bigger. Perhaps they're signs that this God that I've been speaking about does actually exist. The God who created us, who does indeed invest life with meaning and purpose and love and justice. Perhaps that deep sense of gratitude that many of us feel, if we're honest and we think about it, to which a festival like Thanksgiving can point, perhaps that does have a purpose. Perhaps there is somebody to be grateful to. You see, fear disconnects us from each other. It disconnects us from ourselves. It disconnects us from nature. It disconnects us from God. Yet, interestingly, this is a God who in the Bible, time and time again, says, do not fear and do not worry. In fact, the most common command that Jesus Christ gave, if you were to read his teachings in the Bible, is do not fear, do not worry. Time after time after time, he said to people, do not fear, do not be afraid, do not worry. And of course, it's easy to look at those teachings of Jesus and say, well, so what? What does that mean in a world full of fear and terror? What does that mean in a world post 9/11? How can we not fear? How can we stop being anxious? How can we stop being worried? Have you seen my life? Is a temptation to say to Jesus. Have you seen the things I face? How can we be free from fear? How can we be thankful in a post 9/11 world? Well, I would suggest to you that we have a very simple choice. We have a very simple choice. And the choice is this: which pole do you orientate your life around? Fear or thanksgiving? Anxiety or hope? Gratitude or worry? It's a very simple choice. There are two choices, two poles to choose, or two stories, if you like, to choose from. Two stories to choose to orientate your lives around. And there are only two, and not choosing is still a choice. Let me tell you a story to illustrate what I mean to you. The story concerns a gentleman called Boris Nikolaev Cornfield. He was a surgeon, and he worked in a hospital, in a prison in the former Soviet Union. We don't know what crime he had committed, but he was a political prisoner in the Russian gulags deep in Siberia in the 1950s. His medical skill was so great that despite him being a prisoner, the Soviet authorities put him to work in the hospital prison. While he was in the gulag working away there, he met a Christian prisoner whose quiet faith so impressed him that eventually Dr. Cornfield became a Christian himself. He became a follower of Jesus. He kept that dead quiet because he knew if the authorities found out, it would mean death or worse. But his newfound faith began to have an effect upon him. It affected his morals, it affected his choices, it changed his outlook on life. He increasingly refused to go along with the atrocities that were practiced in the gulag. One day he turned in a guard who he had caught stealing food from a prisoner, and that got him into huge trouble, and the rest of the guards began looking for an opportunity to put him to death because of what he'd done to one of their own. And because of that, he locked himself away in the concentration camp hospital for fear of his life, and just lived in the hospital for fear that if he stepped outside, he'd be killed by one of the guards. One day in the hospital, as he was examining a prisoner, suddenly he felt the urge to begin to describe to that patient the story of what had happened to him. And once he began doing that, telling his story, more and more poured out. And before he could help himself, he told his entire tale. Long into the night, he told his story to this patient of how he'd come to faith in Jesus Christ, the difference God had made in his life. Long into the night, they talked. The young patient who he'd been talking to awoke the next morning to the sound of running feet. For during the night, while Dr. Cornfield had slept, somebody had crept up and dealt him 8 blows to his head with a plasterer's mallet, and the doctor was dead. The orderlies carried his still and broken body out of the hospital ward. But the thing is this, the patient to whom Dr. Cornfield had shared his story was so impressed that he too became a Christian. And he was a man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Any of you here who are students of history may have heard of the name Solzhenitsyn because he had a huge impact on world affairs, because he too was a political prisoner, and he began to write. And the books that he wrote were eventually smuggled out of the Gulag and published in the West, and it caused an outcry and a revulsion at what was going on in the Soviet Union. And historians would say the movement that Solzhenitsyn's writing started eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Millions upon millions of people were killed in the gulags, atrocities carried out by ordinary men and women. And as Solzhenitsyn wrote in one of his books, he said this. He said, "As I reflected, gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, not between political parties, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. The line between good and evil passes right through all human hearts. There are 2 choices, 2 doors, 2 stories around which you can choose to orientate your life, and they have major consequences." The first story, very quickly, we have already touched on this evening. It's the naturalistic, atheistic story of what life is like without God. According to this first story, there is no God, there is just us, probably alone in an infinite universe. And what is the purpose of human life? Well, there is none. Existentially, you and I are just brief sparks in the infinite blackness. And when we wink out, when our lives are over, well, that's it. And ultimately, human beings too, well, we're going to go the way of the dodo. We're going to go the way of every species. And when we're gone, well, life on Earth will go on for a little while. And then eventually the sun will expand, it will swallow the Earth, and the solar system we inhabit now will become a cold, dead core. And then one day too, the universe itself, well, that too, millions of years, billions of years from now, that will also end. Dark and cold and empty and silent as the tomb. There is no escape, there is no meaning, there is no hope. And it's hard, if not impossible, I suggest to you, to actually live out this story consistently. The science writer Lauren Isley, who wrote a few years ago, he summed it up nicely. He said this, he said, human beings are cosmic orphans. He said, we're the only creature in the world that ask why. Every other creature, he said, well, they just live by instincts. Other animals don't worry about their death. Human beings know their mortality. We fear death. We see it coming. We ask questions like, who am I? And why am I here? And what does it all mean? Isley said, because of this, we're not like other creatures. And he went on and said, without the sense of the holy, without a sense of compassion, he said, the mind of the human being can become a grey, stalking terror, the ultimate deviser of the concentration camps. Pretty cheerful stuff, eh? Even atheists acknowledge it's a gloomy picture. Canadian philosopher Kai Nielsen, who's a well-known Canadian atheist and philosopher, he's written many articles describing this meaninglessness, this purposelessness, the meaninglessness of life without God. And he famously summed it up nicely. He said, the picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. Bertrand Russell, another famous atheist a few generations ago, he was the Richard Dawkins of his day. He said this, he said, we must build our lives upon the firm foundation of unyielding despair. It takes a tough-minded individual to live that way. Many people I encounter who don't believe in God forget about this. They try and deny it. They try and distract themselves. You try and avoid asking the tough questions. And the interesting question tonight is this. What does it mean to be thankful on this kind of story? Well, it's hard to say, because who are we thankful to? Who are we grateful to if ultimately there is no meaning, if ultimately there is nobody there? Whether you live your life selfishly or whether you live your life with gratitude, ultimately it makes no difference, because ultimately there is no meaning. It's a bleak story. But there's another story that I want to share with you this evening, finally, in the last part of my talk with you this evening. There's another story I want to share with you, a countercultural story, an alternative story, the Christian story. And it's a story I would want to argue gives you far more ground and makes far more sense of most of the things that matter to you and I this evening. It also gives us a foundation for gratitude and a foundation for thanksgiving, a confidence and a hope and a freedom from those things that we are fearful and anxious about. And it's a particularly interesting story when it comes to the whole question of thanksgiving. You see, I'm not sure how many of you know this this evening, but the New Testament, that's the part of the Christian Bible that talks about Jesus Christ and what he did. The New Testament part of the Bible was originally written in Greek. Amazingly, it wasn't written in English. I always thought every great work of literature had to be written in English. Sadly, this is not the case. The Bible was written in Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek. And it uses the word thanksgiving in the New Testament 70 times. 70 times the New Testament uses the word Greek. And where it does, the Greek word it uses is really interesting. It uses a word that's pronounced Eucharistoi. Eucharistoi. And we get an English word from that Greek word, Eucharist. Now, any of you who've been to church, whether you come regularly or you get dragged along by friends and family at Christmas and Easter and when the local church have a Thanksgiving evening, may have just picked up the fact that Christians do use the word Eucharist occasionally. And Eucharist is the word many Christians use to describe the celebration that churches hold regularly, where bread is eaten and wine is drunk, to celebrate what Jesus Christ did that first Easter when he gave his life in self-sacrifice, that great act of love on the cross. Eucharist, that self-sacrifice, that act of self-giving love, lies at the heart of the Christian message. It's what the Christian story is all about. And millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of Christians every week celebrate that story, celebrate what Jesus did with a thanksgiving meal, the Eucharist. Christians celebrate Thanksgiving every week. At the very center, at the very heart, right at the core of the Christian story lies a thanksgiving. Tonight we've enjoyed a fantastic Thanksgiving meal. We've enjoyed half of a fantastic Thanksgiving meal. We have dessert to come, always the best part of any meal in my book. And this Thanksgiving meal may, I suspect for many of us, be one of many we're going to celebrate this weekend with our friends and family. But the great news is this: God also wants to invite us to a Thanksgiving meal. God also wants to invite us to a Thanksgiving meal, to experience genuine Thanksgiving. And the question is simply this: not can you come, but will you come? Not can you come, but will you come? There are two stories, you see, that you can choose to orientate your life around. You can choose meaning or meaninglessness. You can choose hope or hopelessness. You can choose purpose or purposelessness, thanksgiving or alienation. Only when your life is orientated towards the correct story will ultimately we be genuinely free from fear and anxiety. I spoke earlier at the start of this evening how fear causes disconnection. It disconnects us from our friends and our community. It disconnects us from each other. It disconnects us from nature. It disconnects us from God. And the interesting thing is this: Jesus told quite a well-known story about disconnection. He told quite a well-known story about fear and disconnection. And as we draw to a close, I just want to share it with you and make two brief points as we come to an end. Jesus told a story about a father, about a man who had two sons. And one day, said Jesus, the younger son came to his father and said, "Father, I want my share of the inheritance now. I'm not prepared to wait until you snuff it. I want my share of the inheritance now." His father gave in and divided his money between his younger son and his older son. And the younger son very quickly took the money and fled the family home and went travelling in a far distant country, spending the money that his father had given him in wild living. But when he had spent all he had and the funds had run out, a famine struck the country in which he was living, and he was in desperate need. Out of desperation, he took the only job he could find, the lowest job there was in the economy, not a banker, that would be today. He actually became a farmer and started feeding pigs. And so hungry was he as he worked for this farmer, he longed to fill his stomach, Jesus said, with the swill that the pigs were eating. He was that desperate. As he sort of sat there in the mud and the desperation and the smell, pigs are not not nice animals. He reflected and thought, this is nuts. This is madness. Even my father's servants have food to spare. I know what I have to do, he realized. He said, I will go home. I will make my way home and hitchhike home. And I will go to my father and I will say, Father, I have wronged God and I have wronged you. Please take me back as one of your servants. I don't deserve to be your son, but please hire me as a servant. And so he set off. And while he was still a long way from home on the road, it was quite flat country, his father, who was standing at the gates, looked in the distance and saw his son coming. His father scooped up his robes and he ran to meet his son. He flung his arms around him, he embraced him, he kissed him. The son began his speech, Father, I have wronged, but the father was having nothing of it. He interrupted him. He called for the servants. He said, bring a fresh set of clothes, bring shoes for his feet, put a ring on his finger, go and fetch the grain-fed ox and kill it. We're having an ox roast tonight. We're going to celebrate because my son who was lost has been found again. He was dead but is now alive. He has returned to me. During this time, the older son, the older brother, was out in the field. At the end of the working day, he came back home, and as he approached the family home, he heard the sound of this wild party in full session. He called a servant and asked what was going on, and on being told that his younger brother had returned, he stormed off in a sulk and refused to come in to the party. His father had to go out to him and he tried to reason with him, but the older son refused to listen. He said, all these years I've worked for you, I've caused you no trouble, I've obeyed everything you've asked me to do. Never once have you thrown a party for me and my friends. Now this son of yours, who has wasted half of the family money on prostitutes and wild living, well, he's now returned and you decide to celebrate. His father replied with compassion, my son, he said, everything I have has always been yours. You have always been with me. But this is now a time to celebrate because your brother was lost and is found, was dead and is now alive again. That story is called the parable of the prodigal son. It's one of the most famous stories that Jesus told. And the interesting thing is this. Both sons in that parable were afraid. Both sons in that story were afraid. The younger son was afraid of boredom and mediocrity, so he hit the money and ran, thinking life would be better elsewhere, hit rock bottom and finally realized that he had to humbly go home and ask forgiveness from the father he had rejected. And of course, on his return, what did he find? He didn't find rebuke and punishment, but he found forgiveness and he found a Thanksgiving party. He found a party to celebrate his homecoming. It's fascinating as an aside. I don't know if you realize this. I was doing a little bit of reading as I prepared for tonight, and I discovered this fascinating piece of trivia that ties in quite nicely with this. The first Canadian Thanksgiving actually took place in 1578. So you guys have been partying for quite a while. 1578. And it was actually not a harvest festival so much. It was a celebration for a homecoming. An English navigator called Martin Frobisher had been taking a number of dangerous sea voyages trying to find the Northwest Passage, had almost died, had returned home safely, and he wanted to thank God for his safe homecoming. So the first Thanksgiving here in Canada was to celebrate a homecoming. The father in the story threw a homecoming Thanksgiving for his son who was lost. Could this year's Thanksgiving, for some of us, be a celebration for your own safe return? I wonder. But what of the older son in the story? What about the older son whose story we heard at the end? He refused to join the party. Why? What was going on there? Well, I think he was also possibly afraid in his own way. Perhaps, like his younger brother, he too had his own demons that he'd never really faced, and he didn't want to face up to them. Maybe he was proud and arrogant. He had a certain place in the family home, and now his younger brother was back and everything was going to change. Perhaps he wanted to be the center of attention himself, the captain of his own destiny, and so he too was fearful. And the fascinating thing about that story that I've just told you from the Bible is this. It ends with a question. It ends, in a sense, with a question. Jesus didn't tell us, when he told that story, what happened at the end. We don't know if the older son came into the Thanksgiving party. We don't know if he refused to come in and stayed out in the field or whether he came back in. The story ends, in a sense, with that question open. Will he join the party? Will he come in? Will we come in? You see, I suspect that this evening, looking around as much as I can see in the gloom out here this evening, I suspect that we actually have younger brothers and older brothers here in the church tonight. What do I mean by that? Well, I suspect that some of us here this evening, perhaps, are a little bit like the younger brother in that story. Perhaps there are some of us here this evening who are ourselves, if we asked and we were honest, well, we're far from God. If we believe in him at all, maybe we've got no time for any of that God nonsense. Far from God, stumbling along, questioning, wondering, worrying, fearing, worrying that maybe if God does exist, we're too bad for him anyway, worried that God doesn't care, that he can't really love us, he couldn't forgive us, heal us, help us. God is for good people, and I'm not one of those. Maybe we're afraid too that if we did turn and look for God, he wouldn't be there. Maybe we don't believe that God doesn't exist, we're afraid he doesn't, but actually we haven't got the confidence to turn and look. Or maybe some of us this evening are actually afraid that he is, and wonder what kind of God he might be if we actually stopped running and let him catch us up. Some of us here this evening, I suspect, are like younger brothers. But then I suspect we also have a few older brothers here this evening. Too clever, perhaps, too smart, proud, stubborn, too clever to be taken in by all that religion nonsense that goes on at the local church, self-reliant, self-sufficient, self-confident, maybe stubborn even, yet afraid, if we're honest, of exploring just how black life is if God doesn't exist. So we try not to think about it for fear of what it might really look like. The great thing about that story, the great thing about Thanksgiving, the message I want to leave you with is this. God invites us, each one of us, to come home. God invites each one of us to come home, and the choice to respond is ultimately up to you. No one else can make that choice for you. Will we come in to the feast that God invites us to? Will we discover what Thanksgiving really means in 2010, if there is a God to be thankful to, a God who longs, like that father in the story that Jesus told, for us to come home, turn back to him so he can welcome us in to his Thanksgiving, to take us with our fears and our worries, our questions and our anxieties. God is big enough to handle all of them. One of my favourite novelists is a gentleman called C.S. Lewis. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a famous English author who lived a few years ago. He once wrote this, and it's a line I shall leave you with this evening. He said, "If only we have the will to walk, God is pleased with our stumbling." If we only have the will to walk, God is pleased with our stumbling. Will we walk in? If you're a visitor here this evening, and what you've seen or heard over the last kind of an hour, the drama, the music, some of the stuff I've talked about has intrigued you, I encourage you to talk to the person who brought you this evening. Many of you were dragged by friends, or find one of the staff here from the church who'll be happy to sort of talk to you more. And I encourage you to explore some of the questions we've looked at this evening. Let 2010 and Thanksgiving be a special one when you discover the God who is really there. Thank you.